Hi, John. Welcome back to the FINITE Podcast.
Thanks, Jodi. Thanks for having me on again.
You're very welcome. And I say welcome back because you came on the FINITE Podcast around 2 years ago to talk to our then host, Alex Price, about your recent research and all the things you were doing at Ehrenberg-Bass. And the episode did so well and remains to be one of our listeners' favorites. So I thought, why not come back?
Fantastic. It was one of my favourite ones as well. So I'm really excited to be back and talking about B2B acquisition versus retention and those sort of related concepts.
Exactly. It's all about B2B on the FINITE Podcast, so I'm glad you enjoy it. So before we get into that topic, what it means and defining it a little bit more, could you tell us a bit about yourself, where you are, where you come from, your background in marketing, and about the Ehrenberg-Bass? I'm sure most people know what Ehrenberg-Bass Institute is by now, but if you give us a little rundown, that'd be great.
Sure. So I'm John Dawes, Professor of Marketing, as well as I'm one of the Associate Directors for Ehrenberg-Bass, and I've been with Ehrenberg-Bass, or the research centres that kind of preceded it, for about 30 years now. So I'm based, like Ehrenberg-Bass is, based in Adelaide, Australia, but the Institute is very kind of mobile, so at any point in time we've got researchers travelling to all corners of the globe, spreading the word to our Institute sponsors and attending conferences and things like that, talking about evidence-based marketing.
Cool. Evidence-based marketing. I feel like that's a little bit of jargon. Could you please explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, well, I mean, marketing is a field, fairly young field, really. You know, like the formal study of marketing is only around 50 or 60, 70 years old. And what we mean by evidence-based is operating on evidence that's been shown to hold over, over different product categories, brands, time periods, countries, and things like that. So what we do is we do research into all aspects of marketing, like, buyer behavior, brand performance metrics, how advertising works, how brands grow and decline. What we do is we gather some evidence about one of those topics, look at the results and think, well, okay, let's see if we can replicate that for another category, for other countries, for other time periods. And the idea is to develop knowledge for marketing managers that's based on a kind of a robust knowledge base, and we call that empirical generalizations, or developing an evidence-based approach to marketing.
That's amazing. So you're uncovering the fundamentals of what makes marketing tick, really. And I feel like that's so important because I feel like kind of more formalized marketing education can be so easily critiqued because the world of marketing moves so quickly. And so you're getting rid of all of the fluff on the top and thinking about, what the fundamentals are. Amazing.
Yes. I mean, it's fair to say that, there is no shortage of pundits and commentators on marketing who spout a lot of opinion on the way in which marketing works or the way that brands succeed. But, we think there's a place for really well-grounded evidence about those sorts of things so that managers can make more grounded decisions.
Definitely. People get so caught up in the fact that they started a company and it really works for them, but that doesn't necessarily mean it will work for all.
Exactly. I mean, a nice anecdote is, we all know that smoking causes cancer, but a lot of people might say, well, I've got an aunt who lived to 102 and she smokes cigars every day, but that doesn't mean that that's a good recipe for a healthy lifestyle.
Yeah. Broader causality over individual.
Exactly, that's right.
Awesome. So let's get into this exciting topic, the relative importance of acquisition versus retention. So I guess we're talking about which marketers should prioritize in order to stabilize their growth, or reach hypergrowth. Should they be focusing on making their customers more loyal, or should they be focusing on just getting new ones?
Yeah.
So I want to start by getting your broad opinion on the subject. What's your opinion on the whole debate, and which one do you think, just off the cuff, is more important for growth?
Great. So, I mean, this is a really kind of important topic, and it's been quite a prominent one for over 30 years. And the idea has been, look, it's supposed to be, it's more expensive to win new customers than keep your existing ones. Therefore, you should focus on retention because it's financially efficient. And probably everybody has heard that line or that tale around, it costs 5 times as much to win a new customer as keep an old one. Therefore, we should have our primary focus on retaining, keeping existing customers. It's worth pointing out that while that's one of the most famous quotes in marketing and indeed in business, there's actually no evidence for it at all, even though it's been banging around for about 30 years. It's just 100 different people all quoting each other. So all of those articles in magazines and the business press and in consultants' talks that say things like it's 5 times as much to win a new one as keep an old one, etc. No evidence for that at all. It can be traced back to, basically, it was a magazine article in which it was a thought experiment by the owner of a car yard who speculated on, how much he spent on advertising, and he decided how many new versus existing customers he had. And there's no actual evidence about it. It was just a thought experiment. So that highlights the fact that, we have to be careful about acting on anecdotes rather than evidence. But anyway, so that thinking is based on the idea that firms lose customers because they're doing something wrong, right? We're losing some customers. It must be because we're doing something wrong. They're unhappy or they're dissatisfied, etc. And while that's intuitive, and indeed, if you've got a customer that's unhappy with what you're doing, obviously you've got to try and remediate that situation and try and save them. But there's a lot of research in consumer markets, but also in B2B, that shows that a lot of customers stop being a customer of a B2B firm, not because they're dissatisfied. In fact, most customers who leave a B2B firm, they're actually highly satisfied, but something else happened. They were attracted by a better offer, or there was some structural reason, like some higher up in their organization, they were told to do things differently. And so they had to, stop dealing with one particular firm and perhaps start dealing with others. So what that means is a lot of customer loss is kind of unavoidable. And in turn, what that means is you've got to have an acquisition mindset just to stay still, right? So imagine you're a B2B firm, you've got 100 clients. You could probably expect to lose something like, say 10% of them a year. And what that means is you've got to find 10 new ones just to stay the same size. So like an acquisition mindset is kind of not an option, even if you just want to stand still, let alone grow.
I love that explanation, and especially the story at the beginning about someone who works for a car yard.
Yep.
Just proves that what we were talking about before, the proliferation of marketing myths, can be very intense. And I'm sure in the LinkedIn generation, it can be even more so.
Indeed.
And I just want to highlight again that you're saying in B2B situations, there are so many stakeholders and so much complexity within businesses that it is just out of your hands. So I agree that makes total sense. And I can see why we were talking about marketing fundamentals. That feels like something that can't really be argued against. So let's dive into the customer acquisition piece a little bit more. Yeah. So have you got more reasons for supporting customer acquisition? And I'm thinking, especially as businesses mature and they've already acquired a lot of customers, they're kind of in that past that scale up phase. Should they still be focusing on acquisition even then?
Yes. So like there's a related argument to what we were just talking about, that you can grow by either being better at stopping customer loss, right? Like being better at retaining, or by being better at winning new customers. And then some people argue, well, like there's no point in winning new customers if they just leave again. And of course, while that's true, it's not a particularly useful argument in the sense that there's no company that would just go ahead and try and win new customers and then not at all try and look after them. So of course we want to look after our customers, but having an acquisition focus, it doesn't mean that you don't also want to look after your existing customers. Of course you want to do both. And a big point in this is, even for firms, and some of our institute sponsors over the years have told us, and in the B2B space, that they do have a very big focus on retention, cross-selling, upselling, and so on. But, one thing that we pointed out to them was that, yeah, but that's great, but you need to win them before you can start cross-selling to them. So, you still have to have an acquisition mindset. Now, what the research tells us about this is that companies that grow, including B2B firms, is they grow by being better at acquisition, not by better at retention, right? So if we look at firms, B2B firms that are growing, they're still actually losing some customers, but what they're doing is they're growing by being even better. Their rate of new customer acquisition is outpacing the rate at which they're losing. Then the other factor is what we call double jeopardy. And many of the listeners will have heard of double jeopardy before. It's one of the most famous empirical patterns in marketing, and it's basically, the idea is double jeopardy. It means small brands have two problems. Not only do they have fewer customers, but they get somewhat less loyalty from the customers that they have. Conversely, big brands have got lots more customers and a little bit more loyalty. But the main difference between small brands and the big brands in any industry is primarily, overwhelmingly, the size of the customer base, not the loyalty. So what that means is, if you want to grow, you have to increase or expand the size of your customer base, which in turn means an acquisition focus. So we don't see little brands that have the loyalty levels of big brands. So what that tells us is, if I'm a small brand and I want to grow, I can't do it by unilaterally raising my loyalty levels, by being super great at retention. I need to grow by expanding the size of my customer base. So looking outside the firm, winning new customers.
So even those, I'm trying to figure out if there's ever a point where a business should focus more on retention than acquisition.
Right.
Even those big companies who have loads of loyalty and they have loads of customers already. I'm talking hundreds of thousands, etc. Yes. Is there ever a point where companies should focus on this?
I mean, it's certainly an important factor. Okay, but you have to have the dual focus. So, one of the reasons why competing firms have reasonably similar levels of loyalty is, like, they're all trying pretty hard on it. So you take, say, banking, for example. All of the banks try and, they've got good products. They try and cross-sell and upsell. They've got excellent customer service. They've got good account management functions. So what that means is they're all about equally as good at things like retention, but the danger is to start unduly focusing on retention and taking your eye off acquisition. Now, so I don't think there are any cases where you shouldn't have a focus on acquisition, but let's talk about a couple of perhaps instances. Right, so some firms, particularly in B2B, right, you could have really big onboarding costs, right? You could take on a new customer and it could take months to get them properly set up with how they interface with you, have your account management function set up, and so on, right? So in those sort of cases, it would be terrible to lose one of those new firms when you've spent 3 months kind of setting them up, right? So obviously retention would be a big focus there. And then you might also think really hard and have a big focus on retention if you were in an industry that was highly concentrated with customers, right? So if you had some customers that were like 10% of your total revenue, then you would be really, really focused on retaining them, because any one of them could have quite a dramatic impact on your revenue. But even then, you've got to think, look, eventually, right, we're not going to hang on to all of our customers forever. We're going to lose some. And so we have to still have in the pipeline, some potential new customers lined up for the day when we lose, some of our important customers. So, you can have a big focus on retention, but you always have to have an eye on acquisition as well.
Great. And I think that's an important distinction to cover on the FINITE podcast, particularly because there are a lot of B2B brands that are building through winning those big enterprise clients that are worth a lot. So
yes,
that is an interesting distinction. I want to bring it back to the point you said about competition and how a lot of companies can have the same kind of retention strategies. But it almost sounded like you were saying their USP, their unique selling point, came from their acquisition, and that's where they could really flex their muscles and win their category and beat that competition. Is that what you were saying?
Not specifically. I think different firms have different focuses, and they have different ways of communicating the benefits about their products and services to customers. But all of those things tend to kind of come out in the wash in that when you look at basic metrics like their cross-product holdings or retention levels or average levels of tenure, they tend to be reasonably the same for firms of a similar size, even though they're all doing quite different things within an industry.
Okay, great. I know you have thoughts on price sensitivity.
Yes.
We've talked about this before, and could you talk us through about the kind of myths around price sensitivity and how that impacts long-term growth?
Yeah, sure. So there has been this line, for quite a number of years, probably decades actually, that like one of the benefits of developing highly loyal long-term customers is that you can make them less price sensitive. And this sounds intuitive, but it turns out it's not really the case, right? So like at one level, if you've got a variety of customers who have been dealing with you for quite some time and they trust you and your levels of customer service are good, then, at one level that could make you somewhat more insulated against competitors trying to steal your business, right? Because you could well imagine, look, a competitor comes knocking, tries to make them an offer, and they think, well, it's a little bit risky going with a new supplier because, like, I really get quite good service and I trust this existing supplier. So that's certainly, kind of indisputable. However, studies in B2B have found that long-term customers are not necessarily less price sensitive. In fact, the opposite is the case. They can actually become more price sensitive. And the reason is they know that they've been loyal, right? And so that what they want, their pound of flesh. They say, look, we've been a good customer of yours for 5 years, 10 years. You've got to give us the best possible rates you can. We're not going to put up with, a price hike of the magnitude that you're talking about, or we've been checking out the prices of competitors and you're a little bit out of line. So in actual fact, it's a fallacy to think that if I can just hang on to my customers for longer, I'm going to make them less price sensitive. Because for a number of other reasons too, like they learn more about you, they learn what you will or won't offer, and it could be they remember, some favors or some deals that you did with them some years ago. So they say, well, if you did that for us 3 years ago, why can't you do it now? Could also be even they've learned a little bit more about your cost structure. So it actually puts them in a better bargaining position. So yeah, they're not going to let you off the hook. Their job is to extract favorable deals or favorable treatment from suppliers. So it's not as if you get a holiday just because they've been with you for a long, long time.
Yeah, definitely. Do you think that is so much the case in B2B where it is so account focused and account management focused, and you have built those relationships like kind of almost one-to-one?
Yes. Yep. So even in these situations where you have, really good dedicated account management functions, the clients don't necessarily become less price sensitive. They're still out to extract whatever value they can from their suppliers. Yeah.
Great. And what does that bring to the acquisition versus retention debate? What can companies learn from that?
I guess it tells us, again, that we have to have a dual focus. We've got an existing customer base. We look after them to the maximum extent possible. We hire good people to look after them who are skillful in, selling benefits and looking for opportunities to cross-sell and upsell. But we don't want to kind of exist in a fantasy land where we think we can start charging higher prices compared to competitors just because they've been with us for a long time. And also, we have to bear in mind that, it could be the case that one of our, long-term trusted, valued customers will come to us and say, look, I've been offered a better deal from a competitor. We can't match it. So unfortunately, perhaps we lose them. So how are we going to replace that lost revenue? And the answer is, well, unless we've got a robust customer acquisition strategy, we're going to be in trouble because we aren't priming the pipeline.
Right, so it's an important factor in retention and one that companies can often overlook. I think you're doing a really great job of articulating that, like you say, duality of acquisition and retention, with almost like it sounds like an emphasis on acquisition, but without neglecting that retention piece.
Indeed.
I'd love to, while we're on a bit of a myth-busting roll, I'd like to bust another myth.
Sure.
And I know you also have thoughts on this. Could you talk us through the Net Promoter Score myth, where this came from and what it means?
Sure. So the reason that this is kind of relevant is, we're talking about retention, which is an aspect of, trying to engender customer loyalty. And the idea of Net Promoter is that, well, it was originally promulgated by a guy called Fred Reichheld, who was a senior consultant in Bain, the big consultancy company. And he wrote some Harvard Business Review articles and a book about Net Promoter and said, the idea is we want to, delight our customers to the extent that they're highly loyal and they'll recommend us to others. And that will be the way that we'll grow, by maximizing the opportunities for retention amongst the current customer base, and our delighted customers kind of act as a de facto free marketing department for us. Now, Net Promoter essentially boils down to a survey question or survey system in which we ask our customers, how likely would you be to recommend us to friends or colleagues? And the people who give us 9 or 10 are called promoters, and the people who give us 0 to 6 are called detractors. And the idea of the Net Promoter is that we subtract the 0s to 6s from the 9s to 10s, and we get like a net score. Turns out to be a terrible idea, subtracting one from the other. It creates a really unstable metric, which I've talked about in some other podcasts and wrote a study about that. Despite all of those problems, Net Promoter has been itself very well promoted or marketed to industry. It's used by the majority of Fortune 500 companies. So it's a measure of likely to recommend, which is, in a sense, some people see that as a loyalty metric. In theory, Net Promoter is meant to tell you if you're going to grow, and that was supported in, for instance, the book by Reichheld. He showed some graphs purporting to show firms with higher Net Promoter scores enjoyed higher rates of subsequent growth. All sorts of problems with those analyses. Carefully read the book. For instance, you might think, well, the examples seem to be possibly cherry-picked and that they're meant to be 30 or 40 industries that Reichheld and Bain combed through to examine the evidence for Net Promoter, but they only show evidence for about 6 or 7, so we don't know what the other sort of 20-odd look like. The key thing about Net Promoter is, at its heart, it's tapping the sentiment amongst our existing customer base. In essence, kind of like, how happy are they with us? In fact, Net Promoter correlates super highly with customer satisfaction metrics. So, yeah, at its heart, it's telling us about how well we're doing amongst our current customers. Now, as we've been talking through in the podcast, that's all well and good. But if I need to grow, if I want to grow, knowing how good I'm doing with my current customers doesn't really tell me. I need to know about what's happening with people who don't currently deal with me, who aren't currently customers, right? I can't grow amongst my current customer base. They already buy from me. The only way I can really grow is to substantially expand the size of my customer base. A Net Promoter doesn't really tell me about that. I get an indication of people's likelihood to recommend, but that's not the same as actual recommendation. In fact, most people who say they're really likely to recommend me, they don't end up recommending. So yeah, Net Promoter doesn't really give me a robust indication of the likelihood that I'll actually grow in the future. We need to look at some different metrics for that.
So you're saying that customers aren't great marketers. People aren't talking about your brand. People aren't like, hey, how are you? Have you heard of my new B2B tech software
That's right.
that I'm using?
That's right. I mean,
it does seem...
we can all sort of think, like, in the last week or two, has anybody recommended a brand to me? It doesn't seem to happen that often, but you could pretty much survey anybody at any point in time and ask them, look, how happy are you with your supplier of this? Or, you bought X, Y, or Z, pretty happy with it. How likely would you be to recommend it to other people? And most time the responses will be, 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10. But do we engage in that high level of recommendation? No, principally because the topic doesn't come up in conversation. So, yeah, we get an inflated view of the amount of recommendation that goes on by using tools like Net Promoter, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's easy to see where that inflation comes from, especially if marketers are in communities like FINITE. People are recommending tools all the time, but I mean, it's called FINITE for a reason. Like, there's a finite amount of B2B tech marketers, yes, and they're not all just buying MarTech. They're not the only ones buying MarTech. So yes. Yeah, definitely. I'm sure in these like niche bubbles there are some kind of recommendations going on and on LinkedIn, but yeah,
it happens sometimes. I mean, we had some conversations with like, for instance, an accountancy firm, and they said, look, a lot of their business comes from recommendation. Okay, that's good, but that doesn't mean that they should not do other things, because like, people are more likely to act on a recommendation if it's for a firm or a brand that they've heard of before, via advertising. So, even if you're in a market where there is a fair bit of recommendation influence, you still need to do things like advertising to make that recommendation work harder.
Definitely. We don't have time to go into the brand versus performance kind of debate at the moment, although I love that debate.
Yes.
But it's a really good point to mention that, yeah, everything works if people already know your brand.
That's right.
So you mentioned the Net Promoter Score is not a good metric for measuring growth, which it has been so flouted to be. What is a good metric for measuring growth, if you have any?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, that's a really good question. So let's just wind back just a little bit and say, look, remember we said a famous pattern called double jeopardy. The difference between big and small brands is the size of the customer base, less so the loyalty of the customer base. If we then kind of just peel that back a little bit and say, all right, but why are some brands big and some brands small? In any given industry, you can see like the market leaders could be 30 times the size of the small players. Why are they so big, yet the others are so small? And that can persist for years. Is it because they've got better products? No, not really. That's not the answer. Is it because they've got smarter people? No, that's probably not the answer, because over the years, managers come and go, staff come and go. So it's not something like that. So we've found the key difference between big and small brands boils down to two principal factors, what we call mental availability and physical availability, right? So big brands have the advantage of that they've built higher levels of mental availability through their marketing spend, over years, over decades. In other words, more people know about them, more people have heard about them. They're kind of linked in more prospective clients' minds. That's why they're big, right? Because when that potential client comes into the market, that brand with high levels of mental availability is one that they would think of and would consider would get on the short list for serious consideration for purchase. So that's what we call mental availability, like widespread links in many people's minds to multiple buying situations. And then physical availability means some brands are more noticeable in buying situations. When a prospective client enters the market, they're going to see and hear and notice some brands more than others, and we call that physical availability, right? They're more prominent in Google search, they're more prominent on reseller sites, they've got more expansive account management functions. They're kind of it's almost like you can't enter the market without coming across them. So that's the difference between big and small brands. What that means is if you're a little brand, how do you grow? The answer is, well, you need to assess your current levels of mental availability and physical availability. They're probably going to be low, and you need a plan to make them bigger. That's going to take some spending and some time, but that's really the only way to get robust long-term growth is to start improving your status on those two key metrics. Now that sounds like a mouthful, but there are some really good books on this. So my colleagues at Ehrenberg-Bass, Byron Sharp and Jenny Romanick, have written two really good books about these topics. They're called How Brands Grow, which is what we call the Red Book, and How Brands Grow 2, which is the Blue Book. Both of them cover consumer goods, services, and B2B. B2B is probably more expansively covered in How Brands Grow 2, but they're easily digestible as well as bringing a lot of evidence to the table. So I'd recommend, if you're a B2B marketer interested in growth and the concepts that we've been talking in the podcast, by all means, get yourself a copy of How Brands Grow.
Yeah, definitely. I highly recommend that too. What a great way to end as well. We did end up talking about brand because it is so important, and that is Ehrenberg-Bass's one of their main messages. So thank you for that. I think we've done such a good job of busting the marketing myths and finding those fundamentals, just like we talked about in the beginning. So thank you so much.
My pleasure, Jodi. Thanks for having me on the show.